In this tutorial, we're going to review how to use Excel's built-in functions. Let's head back over to our practical application workbook. For this tutorial, we're going to be working from the Using Functions worksheet. I'm going to go ahead and jump over there. In our prior lessons, we learned that functions typically take arguments that are often referred to as inputs, perform some magic behind the scenes on those inputs, and then return some information, often referred to as outputs. Let's see how this process works by using some of Excel's built-in functions to help us solve some simple problems. In our first example, we're going to be using a function to average numbers. Our goal is to use Excel's average function to find the average of the numbers 0 through 10. So let's go ahead and get started writing that. Just as with formulas, functions always need to start with the equal sign. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, the function we want to use is actually called average. If we start typing, you'll notice that we're getting a drop down here that shows us some options to pick from. You can actually use the down arrow to kind of go through those options, and you'll see average is the first option that we have. And we have a little description out to the side of what it does. Now, we could keep typing the word average out on our own, or since we have average selected here, we could actually use the tab key and it will fill in the function for us. So in Excel, anytime that you're actually writing a function, you're going to get a little tooltip down here. The tooltip is going to consist of two parts. One is going to launch a help menu. So you can see if I hover over average, I get a hyperlink. If I click that hyperlink, I'm actually going to get to a help menu. Now the help menus in Excel are actually quite useful. They usually give you some examples and some descriptions and talk about the parameters themselves. For now, I'm just going to go ahead and close this out. The next thing we get in our tooltip is a list of the arguments that the function takes. So here you can see the function expects a number separated by a comma and another number separated by a comma and so on. Now, there are a few conventions I'd like to point out here. The second argument is surrounded by square brackets. This means that the parameter is optional, or that you don't have to have it. The next convention is the three dots or the ellipse at the end. This just means that this pattern continues. Therefore, the average function can take number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and so on. So anytime you see the square brackets, that just lets you know that a parameter is optional, and anytime you see the ellipse, it just means the pattern that you're recognizing can continue to go on for a while. So now that you have an understanding of how to write a function, let's go ahead and use the average function to solve our problem here. So if I want to average these numbers, I'm just going to start typing them in. Average 0, we want 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then 10. Now we need to go ahead and close our function off with the parentheses. Now you'll notice that the tooltip goes away, and when we press enter, we'll actually get the value. Now if you remember, we know that this is a formula because we can see in the formula bar what we've typed. So when we're working with a spreadsheet later, it's really easy to remember what we've done. So let's go ahead and move over to our second example. In our second example, we're looking to use a function to obtain information about a date. Specifically, we want to use Excel's weekday function to answer the questions that we have below. The first question we have wants to know what weekday did December 23rd of 1987 fall on. As before, we need to remember to start with an equal sign, and then when we start typing our function, we'll see that we have weekday here. Let's see what our tooltip says. So we have the weekday function. It takes a serial number, and then it takes an optional parameter of a return type. But we don't exactly know what a serial number is. Well, I'm going to save you a little time here. We actually have an entire lesson that's devoted to working with dates and times. For now, just know that a serial number is how Excel represents a date. So we can actually type our date in here. I'm going to pass it in as a string, which means I'm going to surround it by quotes. So if we do 12/23/1987 in the quotes there, and since the return type is optional, I'm just going to leave that parameter out for now. Let's see what we get. Alright, we got 4. That's not exactly a day. So to convert this number into an actual weekday, we just need to know what day Excel considers to be number 1. By default, Excel starts the week on Sunday, i.e. day 1 is equal to Sunday. Therefore, the 4th day would be Wednesday. So in our case, December the 23rd of 1987 happened to fall on a Wednesday. Now I put a question here for you to figure out what weekday your birthday fell on. Does that happen to be your favorite day? So in our first two examples, we were using functions where we actually typed in the values. In practice, you actually don't do that very often. Our third example is going to show us how you can use references instead of hard type values. Here, our objective is to use Excel's max, min, average, sum, and count functions on the monthly expense data that we have here to answer some questions that we have in the table. So here you can see we have some data about monthly bills. We have the bill itself followed by its respective cost. And then we have some questions. For the questions, we show a list of functions that we're going to use and where we're going to enter our functions. So let's see how this is done. In our first question, we want to find the maximum bill cost. So we're going to use the max function. Start with the equal sign, enter max, open our parentheses. Now, you can see that the arguments it takes are a list of numbers. But instead of actually typing the numbers in, we're going to provide it with a reference to numbers that are already stored in the spreadsheet. We can do this by just selecting them. So I'm going to start with the cost of the first bill, hold down the mouse, and drag down until I get to the bottom. So now you can see I have provided the maximum function, the values that are stored in the range C27 to C33. We're going to talk about ranges in our next lesson in detail, but you can see here that the way that they're structured is the starting cell, or the top leftmost cell, followed by a colon, and then the ending cell, or the bottom rightmost cell. So in our case, since we only have one column, it starts at C27, and it goes all the way down to row 33, which would be C33. Now, if we close off this parenthesis, this is actually going to give the maximum function all of the values that are in that range. So you can see here, the maximum function picks up the rent because that was the most expensive bill that we had. Now let's do the same thing with the minimum function. We're going to start with an equal sign, type in min, open parentheses, we're going to select the range of data, and then we're going to close it off. And now you can see we got the electric bill, which is the cheapest on the list at $105. Why don't you pause the video and see if you can get the average, sum, and count ones on your own. I'll give you a few seconds. Okay, I hope that worked out well for you. Let's go ahead and do it together now. To get the average, we're going to start with the equal sign, type the average, and pass it the list of values. To get the sum, we're going to do the same thing. And to get the count, we're also going to do the same thing. You can see that the count is kind of formatted funny. We wouldn't really want it to display in dollars. We can fix that by going up to the number formatting here. Let's just list the count as a number instead. And we don't need decimal places, so we'll go ahead and get rid of those. In this example, you see how we can pass functions values. This is actually extremely useful in Excel. We're typically working with large amounts of data, and to type it in by hand, like we did in the first two examples, would be very tedious. Hopefully you're starting to see how powerful Excel can be. Let's go ahead and take a look at our fourth and final example from this section. Here, we're really going to focus on understanding function arguments. We have a list of questions and concepts that we're going to go over below. So in our first question, we're going to look at the case where you can supply a function more than one argument. Here, we want to round the number that we have to 3 digits. There's a function in Excel that we can use called mround, and that's going to give us a round for a multiple. So if I type mround, you can see that the description says returns a number rounded to the desired multiple. Now the tooltip for this function says it expects a number and a multiple, and you can see that both of these parameters are required because neither of them is surrounded by square brackets. So the number that we want to round is in this cell. We're going to use the reference notation to get it. And then the multiple that we want, the way that this actually works is you just kind of put the digits. So if I did a multiple of 1, it would just round it to the nearest integer. But we don't want that. We actually want 3 decimal places. So if we did 0.1, we would get 1.5. Well, we actually need more digits there, so I'm going to add a 0 and a 0. So that will get us to 3 digits. Now you can see the number rounded is 1.526. So in this case, we used the function mround, and it took 2 arguments that were required. Okay, in our next question, we're actually going to look at optional requirements, or the ones that are surrounded by square brackets. Here, we want to find the starting position of the word essentials in the domain name xLEssentails.com. The find function can help us do this. If we start typing find, we'll see that this returns the starting position of one text string within another text string, and that it is case sensitive. So let's go ahead and look at our tooltip. Here, it takes the find text, the within text, and then an optional parameter for start number. So let's go ahead and search for essentials within the domain name, And for now, we'll just leave the optional parameter out. So we got to enter it as a string. That's why I'm going to surround it by quotes. Essentials. And we want to search it in this domain name. And we're just going to leave the last parameter off altogether. So I'm not even going to put a comma in here. I'm just going to close off the parentheses. Now when we did that, the function returned 7. So you can see that the 7th character is where the word essential starts within a string. The www, that takes up 3, then the period is 4, then xl is 5 and 6, and the essential starts on the 7th character. So that's how we got that. Now, just to understand how an optional parameter works, we could have asked it to start at a particular position. So if we actually asked it to start at, say, the 8th position, it shouldn't find anything because that's already past where our word starts. So let's do that. You notice that we actually got an error message. And that error message is basically telling us that the find function couldn't locate the word essentials in the string that we provided it. And that's because we told it to start after the word essentials. So in our first question, we saw how functions can take more than one argument. In our second question, we saw how to use the optional arguments. Now in our third question, some functions don't actually take an argument at all. A good example of this is the today function. So if we do enter and then today, you'll notice it says returns the current date formatted as a date. Now if I do open parentheses, you can see that the tooltip is telling me not to put anything in. So I'll close that off and press enter, and you can see we have 3/2 of 2016, which happens to be today's date. The very last thing I'd like to cover just one more time to make sure you understand is that some functions can take any number of arguments, and that their pattern is denoted by the ellipse. The sum function is a great example of that. So if we were going to do equals sum and then open it up, you see the number 1 and then the optional number 2 followed by the ellipse, indicating that the pattern would continue. So we could have number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and so on. This comes up frequent in Excel, and it may seem simple with some of the functions like sum or average or count, but it's a little more tricky when you're working with functions that are taking other types of parameters. So let's go ahead and add up the numbers here. We wanted to sum 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Alright, that gives us 35. Well, this concludes everything we're going to cover in the Introduction to Formulas and Functions section. One thing I'd really like to note before we move on is that we paid a lot of attention to things like the order of operations. While these things may seem a little nuanced in the beginning, they're actually quite important for understanding more complex scenarios. That's why we're taking the time to cover them now. Trust me, something as simple as just getting your parentheses in the right spot will make all the difference when you're writing or evaluating complex formulas later in the course. At this point, you're really building your foundation to becoming an Excel wizard. Keep up the great work, and I'll see you in our next tutorial.